Amid a bitter maritime dispute at the Western Philippine Sea, the Philippines and the United States of America have forged another agreement that prepares both countries for a heightened level of defense accord. The so-called Agreement on Enhanced Defense Cooperation signals the US's rebalancing and pivot to Asia-Pacific. The agreement allows more U.S. troops, aircraft, and ships to pass through the Philippines. This agreement is the country's primary pact to the superpower whose leader tours around key allies in Asia this month. The palace, meanwhile, assures the Filipinos that this is not another visiting forces agreement. The palace further vows to make sure that the agreement fully respects the Philippine sovereignty and that there will be no permanence of U.S. troops and that weapons of mass destruction are prohibited. But some watchdogs and militant groups believe that the agreement will just further escalate the tension in Asia.
Ng mga dayuhang gustong magsamantala sa ating bansa.
That it is more beneficial to the U.S. more than to the Philippines, and that Asia is too small for two competing superpowers. Welcome to Opposing Views, a hard, straightforward discussion of today's most pressing issues. The Philippines has engaged once again with the defense pact with its long-standing ally, the United States. The agreement on enhanced defense cooperation is part of a long-standing U.S. plan to rebalance its forces in Asia. It will also welcome President Barack Obama as he visits the Philippines next week. We'll debate about the agreement tonight, and we ask, is the Philippine-U.S. agreement on enhanced defense cooperation necessary? Good evening, I'm Rod Nepomuceno, and this is Opposing Views. Joining us tonight in our discussion is Professor Demetrio Salipsip Jr., President of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Good evening, June.
Good evening.
And welcome to Opposing Views.
Thank you.
All right, June, can you give us your quick thoughts on this topic? Is this agreement necessary?
I think it's very necessary.
And your bullet points. What are your bullet points?
Well, any country or any group that has shared interest must group together to be able to really protect their interest. Because if they do work together, you're able to really conserve more resources. Because I think any group that has shared interest must work together.
All right, thank you very much, June. On the opposing side is Secretary General of the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, or Bayan, Renato Reyes. Nato, good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to Opposing Views. Your quick thoughts on this topic, this issue.
Well, I think this agreement will place the Philippines at a gross disadvantage once again. And it's really hard to believe that the Philippines and the United States actually share common interests, considering one is a superpower and the Philippines is trying to, assert itself and its sovereignty in the region. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we rushing this? Why is the Aquino administration bent on having it signed next week when nobody else except the government has seen the text of this agreement?
All right. Okay, so let's just start the discussion. Now, I'll start off with you, Nato. Do you think the balancing or the rebalancing of U.S. forces here in Asia, do you think it's a threat to the stability of the region?
Well, it will pose a long-term threat to the stability of the region. The U.S. wants to move 60% of its naval assets, its warships in the region. It wants to bring in more troops in the region. They say it's for regional stability, but in their own words, this whole rebalancing thing is intended to project the power of the United States, to assert the United States as a Pacific power. So
to reassert itself.
To reassert itself as a Pacific power to contain a rising China. Ang problema dyan, we might be caught in between two superpowers, no, nagbabanggaan sila, and tayo, yung Pilipinas, we'll be caught in between, and we won't gain much from that conflict. It doesn't serve our national interests. So it's a very dangerous proposition if we want to ride on the bandwagon of the rebalancing when it's not really clear how our national interest is being served by this strategy of the United States.
June, NATO thinks it's the U.S. presence here in Asia, its rebalancing, is a threat to the region. Do you agree with him?
I don't think I don't agree with it, because I think when it comes to rebalancing, I think the U.S. is only protecting its own interest. I think if you think in terms of demographics, the growth of the world population will grow from 7 billion to 9.1 billion by 2050. And most of that population got to be in Asia. So when it comes to business, this is a place where the growth is going to be. Not only that, when it comes to purchasing power will be 56 trillion by 2030. So they're just trying to position themselves because they have their own interest when it comes to their own prosperity and security. They need to protect their interests.
So you're in the way you're saying, they're just protecting their interest. So this is more beneficial for them rather than us.
No,
Is that correct?
I think it's also beneficial for us. Because, for example, some of our territories are already being overtaken by some countries. And I think we need some kind of protection.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that point. Nato, June brings up a good point. No? Our territories have been threatened by, of course, our neighbor, China. And let's face it, when push comes to shove, I don't think we can face off with China. Do you think? So what are your thoughts on that?
Let me state categorically that we are opposed to any incursion, any annexation or violation of our sovereignty by China. And we definitely have to go up against China when they start violating our sovereignty in our territorial waters.
Sorry, you said we have to definitely go up against...
Go up, yeah. But
right.
we can do that through peaceful means, through exhausting diplomatic means, availing of what international law can provide us, such as the filing of a case before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. Now, having said that, it's really misleading for the U.S. to say that their mere presence is going to help us stand up against China, considering that there's nothing in any of our agreements with the United States which will require them to take our side or retaliate against China should there be a confrontation in the disputed waters. So medyo nabobola tayo, no? Dun sa sinasabing they're here to help us, when in fact, any action that they will take, ang una nilang iisipin dyan, what is beneficial for their country, not what is in the interest of the Filipino people. So it's really very dangerous to accept the premise that the U.S. is just here to help us, when in fact, as our guest has said, they're here to protect their own interests, and their own interest is not necessarily the same as our interest.
But you know, they've lost a lot of lives. For example, intervening and participating in the Middle East, for example,
Exactly.
they have lost a lot of lives. They have exhausted a lot of their resources, and to some extent, by coming here, do you think that it's purely their benefit? You think it's really they're doing it for their benefit?
Well, look everywhere they go. No? They bring war. No? Nasa Middle East, so you have Iraq, then you have Afghanistan. No? Previous to that, you had Vietnam. No? They're spreading war and intervention in all these countries. And for what? No? For the big corporations, for their own business interests. So let's start disabusing ourselves from the notion that they're here out of sheer benevolence, that they want to help us, when in fact, they're really doing it because they want to look after their own economic interests.
Okay, that's a good point there, June. He is right. Everywhere that the U.S. goes, there seems to be war. They're supposed to be preserving the peace, but they almost always end up kind of having this military action against some country. What are your thoughts?
It's not necessary, because if you look at history, you will notice that, for example, an established power is always having conflict with a rising power. So, for example, China is a rising power. So, rise and fall of kingdoms, you will notice, is based on the premise that there's an established power and there's a rising power. So, they have to, we need to think in terms of negotiations. And when it comes to the conflict, I think nowadays it could not easily, but I think through negotiation it could be avoided.
Yeah, but do you think though that the U.S. Will you agree though that the U.S.'s pivot here into Asia is in response to I guess their feeling of being threatened by China?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I don't think they're being threatened. I think it's China who feels they're threatened.
Okay. So you don't think that they're coming into here is to protect their own interests vis-a-vis China?
No, of course they're here to protect their interests, and we're also trying to we're trying to collaborate with them to protect our own interest also. Because when it comes to really in terms of sharing this interest and trying to protect each other, based on the agreement, and that's why we need an agreement, because then you've got to line up all the things that has to be done. Because it may not be them really fighting, but when it comes to support, of course, when it comes to materials and ordnance, they can easily support us.
So, Nato, do you think that China's worried?
Well, The U.S.
Or the US is worried rather?
The
Do you
U.S.
think
is
the US is
worried
worried?
about
Yeah.
a rising China.
Yeah.
So the U.S. in their own documents, in their own rebalancing documents, they have pointed to China as a rising power that they have to contain somehow. No? And again, that is in preserving whatever economic and security interest the U.S. has in this region. Now, just to point out the point, they're saying that we need this. No, the problem is no one has even seen a text of this agreement. So it's really hard to say and to judge that we need this when we haven't even seen what is included in this agreement. It has been kept secret from the public, and the only time that we're going to see the agreement is after they already signed it, probably this Monday or Tuesday, when the President of the U.S. comes to the Philippines.
Okay, so June, on the point of NATO, we haven't seen this agreement. So how do we know we really need it?
Oh, well, we really don't know because we haven't seen it.
Yeah, correct. So we don't know if we need it.
No,
you're not sure.
I think what's happening now is they're going to discuss that, and I'm sure our president's going to look after our own interest. And so as a result of that, the negotiations, of course, would be self-respect. They have to respect our sovereignty.
Do you think though that the agreement will have as a result, as a consequence, to escalate the ongoing tension that we have with China? Do you think it will have that kind of impact?
It doesn't have to, but it's up to China, whether they want to escalate it or not. Because I think what's happening today is they're the ones who are aggressively asserting themselves, grabbing land.
Nato, do you think that this will escalate our tension with China?
Well, just imagine a situation when the U.S. starts building up its forces in the disputed waters and China does the same. So there's going to be an arms race in this disputed waters, and where do we find ourselves?
We're in
the middle of that, and we might not stand to gain anything from that arms race.
All right. So we need to take a short break. In the meanwhile, join the discussions online. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/SolarOpposingViews. Follow us also on Twitter at @opposing_views. Stay tuned. You're watching Opposing Views. Welcome back. You're still watching Opposing Views on the Solar News Channel. We have with us Professor Demetrio Salipsip Jr. or Jun of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, and from the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, Renato Reyes. Our debate question for tonight is the Philippine-U.S. agreement on enhanced defense cooperation necessary. Now, Nato, let me ask you. The president and the administration has been insisting that don't worry about this agreement. There will not be any permanence of U.S. troops. There will not be any weapons of mass destruction. We'll make sure that the Constitution is respected. Do you believe in the administration when they say that?
What the administration is trying to say is that, "Oy, trust us.
Yeah,
we got your back."
Yeah.
No?
Yes.
And we can't trust them on this one because we haven't seen the text, and we are aware of how the U.S. has violated a lot of our national interests and our sovereignty over the past years, with the visiting forces agreement, with the grounding of the ship in Tubataha, which up to now they have not paid for. all the reef that was destroyed, no? Because of their ship. So do we really want that again? No? Do we really want all these problems again coming from more troops and more ships from the United States when they clearly have very little regard, very low regard of our domestic laws? Just remember what happened with Daniel Smith, was convicted by a Philippine court, yet was detained inside the U.S. Embassy. Is that the kind of relationship that's mutual and equal? I don't think that's what's going to be reflected in this new agreement.
Okay, June, your thoughts on that? So far, I mean, NATO made reference to the VFA. I think that it's appropriate that we discuss it. At least under the VFA, he mentioned those problems, no?
Yeah, that's why we need to go into an agreement, because that kind of agreement is the one where you really line up the things that needs to be done and the kind of things that must be respected. So that's part of the negotiation, and that's why we're not seeing anything yet, because nothing has been negotiated.
So we're saying that maybe we can learn things from what happened in the past, maybe in the VFA and
the negotiations have been going on for some time now. There have been 8 rounds of the negotiations.
Yeah,
the Philippine side has submitted a text which they said was accepted by the U.S. There was a consensus, no? So there is a text out there that we haven't seen, and we will only see on Monday or Tuesday when they sign it. So everybody's kept in the dark, and they sign it, and it comes into effect. And what are we to do now? How do we question it? They don't even have the decency to subject the whole thing to Senate ratification and concurrence. Even the Senate is kept out of the whole process. So this is a very problematic situation, considering that the Constitution explicitly states that anything that deals with foreign troops and foreign bases should pass through the Senate. Now they're rushing the agreement. They don't want this to go through the Senate. They want this to be implemented immediately. That's why they took the route of an executive agreement and kept the public out of the whole process.
June, why do you think they're rushing it? Why do you think why the rush? And do you think, to the point of NATO, do you think that we're violating the Constitution here?
I don't think we're violating the Constitution, because if we're violating the Constitution, then they could be charged in court. And I think our court system is operative anyway. But I think what's happening is there are lots of things happening, for example, in the West Philippine Sea. And I think what we need to do is really react quite fast, because if they're going to occupy that, what we're going to do?
Yeah. Do you think, though, that the U.S. is very concerned about what's happening in our territories there, or do you think that this is just their way of flexing their muscles?
No, I think, for example, if the world population is going to be here and the world economy is going to be focused here in Asia, that sea lane has to be protected.
Okay, on that point, no, do you think that go ahead, Nato.
Just a question first. Up to now, it's really not clear how this agreement is actually going to help us. There's nothing in the press releases, nothing in the public pronouncements of the government which spell out in clear terms how will an enhanced defense cooperation agreement help us against China. What does this really do? What does the agreement actually give us? It's not clear. Secretary Coloma the other day was quoted as saying, we would like to see clarification on what help the U.S. is actually going to give us. So we are going to sign an agreement on Monday without really knowing what kind of assistance or help the U.S. is going to give us. So, lugi na naman po tayo dito, no? Mukhang maiisahan na naman tayo. What exactly is this agreement going to give us?
Now, just taking off from the title of the agreement, it's enhanced defense cooperation. It sounds like a neat terminology, cooperation. Seems harmless. But do you think, though, does this go against our national sovereignty? Do you think that it affects or has an impact on our national sovereignty, NATO?
A new feature of this agreement is that they will be allowed to access, the U.S. troops will be allowed to access Philippine facilities. They will be allowed to put up their own facilities, the jurisdiction of which is not really clear at this point. They will be allowed to pre-position their weapons. No? So they could put drones, they could put weapons of mass destruction on Philippine soil, and they would say that's legal. Now, that, we think, violates our sovereignty, and if they don't put that through any form of public scrutiny or Senate scrutiny, it would really bring back U.S. bases on our soil under a different name, under a different banner, no? But it's still the same de facto basing that they will enjoy. Do we really want that? Does that really work in our interest? Will that modernize the armed forces of the Philippines. Magkakaroon ba tayo ng bagong mga barko or the capacity to defend the islands? It's not really clear. No? There's no assurance that this agreement will actually lead to the Philippines developing a capacity to ward China, to ward off China from coming into our waters.
And Jun, your thoughts on that? According to NATO, there's no assurance. There's no assurance that these guys, I mean the Americans, of course, will protect us or even teach us. In fact, they will have access to our military bases, right? They'll have access to it, and so I guess insofar as what NATO is saying, that's just a skip away or a hop away into really having de facto their own bases here.
But that's the whole point. We don't know exactly what the agreement is, but we're already assuming that these are the things that will happen.
But you're saying is sign the agreement before we even know what's in it?
No, I do agree with NATO that we should be informed as to what those agreements are, and I think the Freedom of Information Bill is something that would have help us get those kinds of information. We need information so that we are informed.
But in principle, you are for US's I guess heightened presence here.
Yeah.
I mean, in principle, you are.
Yeah, because I think that's the only way for example, to prevent war, you've got to prepare for war.
Okay. All right,
well,
Nato?
The other implication of that is
if
there's a war, then we're automatically dragged into that war. If the U.S. wages war somewhere else and they're stationing their troops here, they're stationing their weapons here, we become a party to that conflict. We become dragged into that conflict. Do we really want to be dragged into that kind of conflict when it's not in our national interest?
There's no territorial dispute between the U.S. and China, though. There is, however, territorial disputes between territorial dispute between the U.S., the Philippines, and China. Well, that's already going on, and there's already some maneuvering going on in the seas, diba?
And if we start hosting their weapons, their troops, and conflict arises, then we are already dragged into that conflict, and we also open ourselves as a target by whoever enemy the U.S. has in the region. And so
but do you think though we're being bullied because we were threatening, bring this to the International Court of Justice and the UN, but they're just scoffing at it?
Well, definitely China is trying to be very assertive, aggressive. There's bullying that's happening, but really, we really have.
But calling one Big Brother is not the.
We can't. We can't choose between two bullies. No? It's not the right approach. No? Why do we have to choose which bully we want in our backyard? No?
Is this a selection of bullies?
No, the problem is if you're in the middle, you're going to get hit. Might as well you take side because in the middle is very dangerous.
All right, good point. All right, we'll take a short break. More on the issue of the Philippine-U.S. Defense Pact when we come back. Please stay with us.
Sa akin, walang problema dahil hindi naman ako against sa Amerika kahit kailan. Mas maganda kung pupunta sila rito ng magandang ang kalalabasan ng pagpunta niya, wala problema.
Hindi. Kasi maliles yung yung opportunity para sa mga Filipino soldiers.
Sa palagay ko po kasi, pinag-aaway lang ng US yung China at Pilipinas para magkaroon na naman ng gera. Para magkaroon na naman sila ng palusot na magtayo ng mga bases dito para daw protektahan tayo. Pero hindi naman talaga ganun yung mangyayari.
For me, hindi. Kasi sa atin tong lugar, dapat bigay ng gobyerno yung yung chance na to para ipakita ng PNP, ng AFP na kaya natin i-handle yung mga gantong situation.
Uy, okay lang kasi alam naman natin, 'di ba, yung mga sundalo naman sa ibang bansa magagaling.
Para sa akin okay din kasi malaki na tulong nila sa hindi lang sa sa paglaban sa China, kundi tulungan din nila tayo sa sa nila sa mga busayap. Doon sa mga pangitan mga gamit nila sa gera, mga ganun.
Welcome back. You're still watching Opposing Views on the Solar News Channel. I'm Rod Nepomuceno. Our guest is Professor Demetrio Salipsip Jr., President of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, and the Secretary General of the Bagong Alyansa Makabayan, or Bayan, Renato Reyes. Our question: is the Philippine-U.S. agreement on enhanced defense cooperation necessary? Now, let's talk about national security. I think a lot of, we saw some of the people being interviewed earlier, and some people I've talked to also as well. Their main point, Nato, is that we really just don't have enough to defend ourselves, and the fact is let's get whatever help we can, knowing already what's happening, that we're already being bullied in the diplomatic channels. So, do you think this will not improve our national security? Yeah. Knowing our history in the U.S., they haven't occupied us. I mean, they probably have the ability to occupy us, but for the past 50 years, I don't know if
they actually did.
They did occupy us. I mean, for the past 50, 60, 70 years, it's not been the case. No? Do you think, and now with the threat in China, do you think that this increases our national security, this agreement?
Let's go into the question of will this modernize the armed forces? Because it's always being told to us that we have the U.S. forces here, and it will lead to modernization of the armed forces. It will lead to the development of a credible external defense. Now, we've had U.S. bases for 40, nearly 50 years, and that did not modernize our AFP. We've had the VFA since 1999, so it's around 15 years of the VFA that has not modernized the AFP. What we've been getting so far are second-hand equipment. We have 2 boats from the United States. We acquired those boats at a cost, no? And those boats came from the 1967 Vietnam War era. No? And the cost of maintenance of these boats is even greater than the acquisition cost. So we're getting hand-me-downs, and this is not going to help modernize our AFP so long as we're getting all this junk from the United States. So will it modernize our AFP? If we base it on the time of the US bases or the time of the VFA, we're still here, we're still backward, and we haven't really gotten much from the US except for all these second-hand military hardware.
Jun, do you think with the U.S. Sort of like showing its head, rearing its head behind us, like a fight, right? When you're fighting a big bully, do you think that increases the risk on our national security? Do you think it bolsters our national security? I mean, let's not. I won't argue anymore regarding our equipment and whether American equipment has really improved our military. We all know that. I kind of have an idea of what the state of our military is. But let's say just having the U.S. kind of going over there and playing in our playground, so to speak, do you think that it increases our national security, or do you think it's a risk?
Because if, for example, they attack the Philippines and there are American troops here, I think they will hesitate to do that. Because if they do that, then, of course, there will be immediate
they still know the U.S. is a military power.
Not only that, I think the agreement that we will have with the U.S. will, of course, inform our friends and our foe that we have some alliances and that we should not just be pushed around.
That's kind of a false sense of security, and it's somehow a bit childish to say na, oy, huwag niyo kaming gagalawin, meron kaming dito, may resba kami, no? Malaki. The problem with that is the U.S. is not mandated to retaliate automatically against China or any other foreign power, even under the Mutual Defense Treaty. If you read the treaty back and forth, There's no automatic retaliation provision. Any response from the United States will still have to go through its own processes. It'll have to go through the U.S. Congress.
So
now,
you think the best that we're going to get is something like a condemnation by Kerry, for example, in the Ukraine situation?
You can have statements, but that might not amount to much once the conflict is there. Furthermore, the U.S. and China, they have a very tight economic relationship now. The U.S. owes China, what, $1.28 trillion. How do you expect the U.S. to go to war with that kind of debt hanging on the ceiling?
Well, some people do that. People who owe someone money, they attack that person.
It could also sink the U.S. economy if they offload all those loans. Okay. Secondly, the U.S. has a lot of investments in China. So their economies are tied. So
that is a good point, Nato. June, there is a very strong, I think he made a good point there, that the U.S. and China, I mean, with all this rhetoric about territorial disputes and all that, and maybe about copyright issues or the fact remains is that NATO has a point here, that the U.S. and the United States are very strong trade partners. So a lot of Chinese companies going now to the U.S. and a lot of U.S. companies now entering China or have entered China. And there's a lot of, I guess, mutual benefit from that relationship. A lot more, certainly, from the benefit that they get from us. Do you think that by having this agreement, this defense agreement, that U.S. is necessarily telling China, don't harm this little brother of ours?
Yeah, because I think they're coming here to strengthen institution and the rule of law. Because I think right now we're trying to follow the rule of law, but China is not trying to follow the rule of law. And I think the presence of the U.S. here will try to impose that and strengthen the institution and strengthen the rule of law.
Do you think the U.S. sees China that way, that they're not following the rule of law?
Definitely, because we're going to court and they don't want to participate.
Well, both China and the U.S. will end up violating and undermining the rule of law. China violating our sovereignty, the U.S. violating our domestic law and our constitution. Do we really want to be part of that? No? Do we really want to choose between which violator do we want in our backyard?
Nato, is it just the fact that it's the U.S.? I know, I mean, historically, and even in your clamor and in your signages, it's always been an anti-U.S. campaign that you've had. And what if, just for argument's sake, it wasn't the U.S.? Let's say it's another country that is having some conflict with China, for example, Japan. And Japan came over here and said, "Oh, let's have some joint military cooperation." Would you have the same issue?
Well, even if it's Japan, even if it's Australia, so long as it's a foreign power trying to interfere, trying to undermine our constitution, trying to undermine our sovereignty, we will have, as a matter of principle, to oppose that foreign power. We don't want to be just merely dictated on by these big powers.
What form of cooperation to you is not an interference, not equivalent to interference? Because my feeling is that, I guess what you're saying is that any involvement that the U.S. military has here is some kind of interference and therefore a violation of the Constitution.
Yeah, because what self-respecting country would allow foreign troops on their soil to be stationed indefinitely and to be exempt from their own domestic laws? That is an affront to our sovereignty. Right. Whether they're American troops, whether Australian troops, or any other nationality, we have to draw a line somewhere when it comes to sovereignty.
June, do you know of any case studies, for example, I mean, in other countries where they allowed something like this, U.S. troops or maybe a foreign military presence in their own bases?
Japan. So Japan, for example, I think that's why we need the agreement, because we have to stipulate that. And I think times have changed, and I think we can insist that we participate in any kind of...
Because in Japan there is a U.S. base, right?
That's right.
Well, there you have it.
Japan, there's a U.S. base. In Korea, there's a U.S. base.
Yeah. Yes. And do you think though they give up their sovereignty just because they have their?
Well, there have been protests in Japan against the U.S. bases that we know for a fact, and the Japanese public have been reeling from the burden of having to pay for these U.S. bases. So it's going to be the same story in the Philippines. We will end up shouldering some of the cost of hosting these foreign
most
troops.
of the Japanese, for example, are against the presence of the U.S. bases?
There was a time that the Japanese Prime Minister had to pledge before the public that he would end the presence of U.S. bases in their country because of extreme public pressure and rejection of these bases.
But,
same thing with Korea. There have been a lot of protests against these U.S. bases. So it's really hard, just to say that since Japan and South Korea are doing it, so should we. No?
Right.
Mahirap
Okay.
naman yung ganun.
All right. Now, let's talk about human rights violations. Now, you think the agreement, again, I don't know if we're jumping the gun here a bit, but you think the agreement would be prone to human rights violations, as you mentioned earlier?
Well, our
the Smith
basis
case?
would be the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Military Bases Agreement of the past. No? Under these agreements, there were violations that happened, and the only reason that nobody went to court is that these violators, the U.S. troops, are often insulated or have immunity when we go after them. So it's quite hard, no, for the victims who can't really file cases because the foreign troops are protected by by this agreement.
Yeah, June, this is another topic altogether, not national security, but human rights violations. There was an instance in the past. Do you think that this could be a case where the U.S. can, again, abuse itself and, yes, violate human rights?
Yeah, they can do that. That's why I think we should get into an agreement where we should insist that this should not happen.
We can definitely go after them legally
right.
if there's any human rights violations.
Yeah,
So-
because without the new agreement, I think that will be perpetuated.
All right, but do you think though that just by having that agreement and spelled out that way, do you think that we're still exposing ourselves too much at risk? Even for assuming arguendo that there was a stipulation regarding that on human rights.
I think somehow we're so afraid. I don't know why we're so afraid to work with an old friend. When it comes to our friends, we demonstrate against them. When somebody tries to get our land, we never demonstrate against them. We pacify our enemy.
Right. Okay.
So that's why sometimes I'm thinking, why are we so against the U.S.?
Well,
Why are we so against the U.S.?
A real friend doesn't violate your constitution. A real friend respects your laws. A real friend that doesn't dump toxic waste on your seas. In your seas, a real friend does not destroy your property and not pay for it. So the whole premise that the U.S. is our friend. We've been saying that for the last half century, and what have we really gotten from this so-called friendship and special relations? It has just violated their sovereignty repeatedly. So it's really time to put our foot down and say, tama na, masyado nyo na kaming nilalamangan eh. No? Walang problema, no? We have no problems being friends. But if we want to stay friends, let's be on some equal footing. May respeto, hindi yung parang nilalamangan nyo kami palagi.
What would be an acceptable military cooperation for, let's say, for Bayan and for most people that are leaning towards your position?
Right now, it's really hard to say something would be acceptable considering the whole framework and the agenda of the U.S. is really to advance its position as a global police and to strengthen its empire. So how do you cooperate with that?
Yeah. Up to what extent, June, up to what extent would you allow U.S. intervention in our military, or let's say that cooperation, as they say, enhanced cooperation, up to what extent do you think they should go na it doesn't violate the Constitution? Because obviously there are quarters in the country that who feel that any kind of incursion that they have, any kind of presence that they have, permanent or not, is basically getting into our affairs. It's involving themselves into our affairs, and this is our affair. We should, up to what extent would you say, all right, that's enough?
Yeah, that's why we have to get that agreement.
Correct. But in your mind, what up to what extent should that cooperation be? Should they have unlimited access to our military bases? Should they be able to take the lead? For example, if there's a situation that calls for war, should they take the lead in declaring the Philippines in war?
Oh, definitely not.
Not.
That's why there should be cooperation, and that's why there should be a dialogue between the two, and that's why an agreement is quite important, because it's difficult, when two people work together, they have to consult their government, we have to get consultation in our own government, and that takes time.
All right, we need to take a short break again. Don't go away. When we come back, the results of our online poll on the issue and the final words of our guests. Please stay tuned. You're watching Opposing Views. Welcome back. This is Opposing Views. I'm Rod Nepomuceno. And we have with us Professor Demetrio Salipsip Jr. of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, and from the Bagong Alyansa Makabayan, Renato Reyes. And our question for this evening is the Philippine-U.S. agreement on enhanced defense cooperation necessary. Now, Nato, we all know the news. The past 20 years, the U.S. In the Middle East. First was Kuwait. They went to war and brought back, I guess, freed Kuwait again. Now they went there and intervened in Afghanistan to get to protect them from these forces, no? These forces that was taking over Afghanistan, and they sacrificed a lot. There are a lot of troops that died, and obviously there's a lot of military resources that were spent on those wars. So they went out. No? They went out and really, I guess, if depending where you're coming from, they defended Kuwait. Do you think that the U.S. is ready to fight for us in case of an all-out attack by China?
Well, the U.S. would really have to evaluate what is in their best interest and what's not. And that's not necessarily what our interests would dictate. So I think right now, with the economic relationship between China and the United States, with the U.S. debt to China, with all the U.S. investments in China and all the Chinese investments in the United States, the economic basis for going to war is not really there. So,
I mean, compared to them going against Iraq.
Yeah. So I don't think it would be wise, and I don't think the U.S. is contemplating that.
You can't use that as a case study that they will go out and defend this.
It's a totally different thing because of all the economic ties the U.S. has with China. In fact, the U.S. went on a charm offensive a few weeks ago. Michelle Obama was in Beijing trying to charm the Chinese public. So medyo ano rin yan away bati, no? The U.S. wants to contain China, but the U.S. still wants to do business with China. And that's their strategic aim.
Jun, do you think when push comes to shove, you think the U.S. will side with us? Or don't you think that, as Nato said, they'll probably side with their creditor and their business partner?
No, I think they will side with us.
You think so?
And I think when it comes to the First Lady going to China, that's part of the diplomacy. So what they're trying to do is prepare for war, but at the same time use diplomacy.
Why will they defend us? Just a simple question. Why will they defend us? What is their interest here? We don't have oil like in the Middle East. We don't. We're their little brother. Why will this is of course I'm asking us kind of an innocent question in a way. Why will they defend us, considering the kind of interests that they have with China?
Because this is a good place also for them to have a base, or for them to be able to replenish their supplies. Because for a naval power to become more powerful, they have to have basing agreements with several countries. So I think if the...
And you think Korea and Japan are not sufficient? Their bases there in Korea?
I don't think so, because for example, those bases are also at risk, then they need some kind of alternatives. And the Philippines is one alternative.
So in your mind, the U.S. really views China as sort of like enemy number one?
Not necessarily as an enemy. It's just that they're expanding, of course, their influence, and they'd like to be able to defend that kind of their own self-interest. And I think they're thinking in terms of they have shared interest with us, and they'd like to work with us.
Now, taking off from that point, you feel that the Philippines is strategically located, not only strategically located, but we're, I guess, not just the location, but we're strategic partners in the region.
That's right.
Do you think, though, that opens the doors more for the Philippines to be sort of like the platform for aggression? Meaning, the other countries are going, the U.S. is having its base there, let's attack that first and hit them where it hurts. And the Philippines becomes collateral damage.
That is possible, because that's what happened during World War II, isn't it? They attack us because there's American bases here. But, you have to take side. It's difficult to be in the middle.
Nato, do we have to take sides? Which side are we on?
Like I said earlier, we do not have to take the side of any of these superpowers.
Just take our side.
Vying for supremacy. Yeah, we take our side. We try to be independent, and the only way we're going to stand up against China if we are independent. If we keep on depending on the U.S., we just shoot ourselves in the foot. We keep undermining ourselves. We keep ourselves very weak because we always think na, meron naman tayong sasandalan eh. It's time for us to take an independent position, an independent foreign policy, to develop our own economy, to develop our capacity to defend ourselves. and avail of all the diplomatic venues that are out there. Let's not get caught in between these two giants. Let's not get caught in this power play. No? Yung interest muna nating Pilipino, yung isipin natin. Hindi yung sino ang kakampihan natin doon sa dalawang higante.
Is there any other country that you'd like to emulate na parang who's standing on their own, that is not really...
Well, in the news today, there was this tiny nation, Marshall Islands, no? And they filed the case against the U.S., against several nuclear powers because of all the nuclear testing that has been going on in the Marshall Islands for how many decades now. Ito maliit na bansa, no? Islands nga lang but they stood up. They stood up to the nuclear powers, no? So why can't we?
Okay. Now, in your mind, Sir Jun, do you think, what case study can you bring forth? You mentioned, of course, Korea and Japan, no? Are there any other countries who are blatantly or outwardly really showing signs, oh no, we're siding with the U.S., and by taking that stance, it has protected them in the long run?
The problem I have is anytime you stand in the middle, you're going to get squeezed. Might as well you take side, because if you don't take side, you'll be in big trouble.
Because, like, for example, if I may, I just came from Taiwan, for example. They've resisted China, and all these years.
Yeah.
So far, nothing's happened to them. It's not like China's attacked them. You know, they have been they've valiantly opposed. In fact, they still some of them still claim the China mainland, no? But they've remained adamant and on their own and independent, and so far they're okay. They're not necessarily siding with the U.S., for example. So do you think that we can just take that stance? No one will. This is our land. We'll take care of ourselves. You know, China, if you want to attack, go ahead, but at your own risk. You know, they're taking that stand. No? It's not like they're siding really with the U.S. So, do you think that we should take that kind of a stand?
I think, for example, if we remain independent and they keep taking the islands that we have, what are we going to do?
Okay, it's a simple question. Not what are we going to do? If they just simply take the islands, what are we going to do?
What we're doing now, what the Philippine government is doing now, is bringing the case to the International Tribunal and trying to get international opinion on our side. In the long term, we have to develop our economy so that we can have the ships, we can have the means to defend our islands. But we're not going to get there if we keep hanging on to the coattails of Uncle Sam. No, that's going to keep us backward and underdeveloped. So, medyo matagal to, no? The capacity to defend ourselves, it's going to take some time. No, we have to build that capacity, but we're not going to get there if we try to, always rely on this so-called big brother who's really just out to exploit the situation for their own ends.
Do you think, in worst case scenario, this will lead to international crime of aggression on the part of the U.S., where they use us as a base, and then go on a counter-offensive, so to speak, to the other?
They've done that in the past when we had bases. No? So you had Vietnam, no? You have the invasion of Kuwait. No? They have used us as a staging ground for wars. They can use us as a staging ground for drone strikes anywhere in the world. So do we really want that complication? No? So mahirap yun.
Do we want that complication? Do we want that complication of being used as a platform for them, whenever they engage themselves against other countries in the theater of war, they could potentially use us. They have used us, according to NATO, in the past as a staging of their wars.
As long as we believe in their purpose in the war, why not? Because if we are allies and we believe in their purpose, then we should work with them.
So we should just allow ourselves to be dragged into these wars every time they... That's the problem.
I guess that's the...
Whether or not you believe in it, the fact that they're here, that means you're already party to that conflict, even if it's not in your national interest.
All right. Final words, Jun. Do you have final words regarding this topic, whether this enhanced defense cooperation is necessary or not? Final words for televiewers.
I think it's necessary because people with shared interests must work together. I think it's better for people to know that there are groups of people whose interest is prosperity and security. And sometimes working alone is more difficult than working with other people. In today's world where collaboration is quite important and everyone's connected, I think working with other people and getting into an agreement is much better, because in that agreement you can stipulate the kind of things that needs to be done. Right. Because without an agreement, it's really very difficult to do that.
Thank you very much, June. Thank you so much for that. Nato, your final words, your message to our televiewers?
The interest of a superpower is not necessarily the same as the interest of the Philippines. And stand up to China, we must. But we have to do it on our own terms and not be dictated on or exploited and used as a tool or a pawn by another superpower. So let's try to do this the right way and not be on the shorter end of the stick.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nato. Thank you, June. Thanks to our guests, Professor Demetrio Solipsip Jr. of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, and of course from the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, Renato Reyes. Now let's see the results of our online poll. Our question: is the Philippine-U.S. agreement on enhanced defense cooperation necessary? Those who answered yes, it is necessary, 60%, and those who said no, 40%. And that's our opposing views for tonight. Tune in again next week for another bold and engaging discussion of today's most relevant issues. I'm Rodney Bombaceno. Good night and God bless. Amid a bitter maritime dispute at the Western Philippine Sea, the Philippines and the United States of America have forged another agreement that prepares both countries for a heightened level of defense accord. The so-called Agreement on Enhanced Defense Cooperation signals the US's rebalancing and pivot to Asia-Pacific. The agreement allows more U.S. troops, aircraft, and ships to pass through the Philippines. This agreement is the country's primary pact to the superpower whose leader tours around.
Any group that has shared interest must work together.
All right, thank you very much, June. On the opposing side is Secretary General of the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, or Bayan, Renato Reyes. Nato, good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to Opposing Views. Your quick thoughts on this topic, this issue.
Well, I think this agreement will place the Philippines at a gross disadvantage once again. And it's really hard to believe that the Philippines and the United States actually share common interests, considering one is a superpower and the Philippines is trying to, assert itself and its sovereignty in the region. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we rushing this? Why is the Aquino administration bent on having it signed next week when nobody else except the government has seen the text of this agreement?
All right. Okay, so let's just start the discussion. Now, I'll start off with you, Nato. Do you think the balancing or the rebalancing of U.S. forces here in Asia, do you think it's a threat to the stability of the region?
Well,
Found key allies in Asia this month. The palace, meanwhile, assures the Filipinos that this is not another visiting forces agreement. The palace further vows to make sure that the agreement fully respects the Philippines' sovereignty and that there will be no permanence of U.S. troops and that weapons of mass destruction are prohibited. But some watchdogs and militant groups believe that the agreement will just further escalate the tension in Asia.
ng mga dayuhang gustong magsamantala sa ating bansa.
That it is more beneficial to the U.S. more than to the Philippines, and that Asia is too small for two competing superpowers. Welcome to Opposing Views, a hard, straightforward discussion of today's most pressing issues. The Philippines has engaged once again with the defense pact with its long-standing ally, the United States. The agreement on enhanced defense cooperation is part of a long-standing U.S. plan to rebalance its forces in Asia. It will also welcome President Barack Obama as he visits the Philippines next week. We'll debate about the agreement tonight. We ask, is the Philippine-U.S. agreement on enhanced defense cooperation necessary? Good evening, I'm Rod Depomuceno, and this is Opposing Views. Joining us tonight in our discussion is Professor Demetrio Salipsip Jr., President of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Good evening, June.
Good evening.
And welcome to Opposing Views.
Thank you.
All right, June, can you give us your quick thoughts on this topic? Is this agreement necessary?
I think it's very necessary.
And your bullet points. What are your bullet points?
Well, any country or any group that has shared interest must group together to be able to really protect their interest. Because if they do work together, you're able to really conserve more resources. Because I think
It will pose a long-term threat to the stability of the region. The U.S. wants to move 60% of its naval assets, its warships in the region. It wants to bring in more troops in the region. They say it's for regional stability, but in their own words, this whole rebalancing thing is intended to project the power of the United States, to assert the United States as a Pacific power. So
To reassert itself.
To reassert itself as a Pacific power to contain a rising China. Ang problema dyan, we might be caught in between two superpowers, no? Nagbabanggaan sila, and tayo, yung Pilipinas, we'll be caught in between, and we won't gain much from that conflict. It doesn't serve our national interests. So it's a very dangerous proposition if we want to ride on the bandwagon of the rebalancing when it's not really clear how our national interest is being served by this strategy of the United States.
June, NATO thinks it's the U.S. presence here in Asia, its rebalancing is a threat to